Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Andrea Piero, Director of the Visiting Artists Program at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's lecture by visiting artist Ibrahim Mahama. Each year, SAIC's Visiting Artists Program hosts a number of lectures by internationally recognized artists, designers, and scholars with the mission to foster a greater understanding and appreciation of contemporary art and culture. Tonight, we are honored to have Ibrahim Mahama become a part of our rich history of distinguished guests who have spoken at the school. I'd like to thank Ibrahim for traveling all the way from Ghana to be here with us this evening to share his work with our community. This evening's program is presented in partnership with SAIC's Institute for Curatorial Research and Practice as part of the ongoing project Reworking Labor, curated by faculty research fellows Daniel Eisenberg and Ellen Rothenberg. I'd like to thank Dan and Ellen for their efforts in helping to bring Ibrahim and his work to SAIC. I would also like to thank the Illinois Arts Council Agency for their support of tonight's program. At the end of the presentation, we'll have about 10 minutes to take 4 or 5 questions from the audience before the program concludes by 7:30. If you have a question, please raise your hand high so our staff can see you and get a microphone to you. We ask that if you're posing a question to please share your name and to keep your question concise. Tonight's program concludes our fall season, and we will announce our spring schedule in the coming weeks. So keep an eye out for our program offerings that will resume again in February. So it's my pleasure to now welcome to the podium Dan Eisenberg, professor in SAIC's Department of Film, Video, New Media, and Animation, and Ellen Rothenberg, adjunct professor in the Department of Fiber and Material Studies, for a joint introduction of Ibrahim Mahama. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. What a great crowd. Good to see you. We're going to do this together, as usual. In the summer of 2017, Ellen Rothenberg and I accompanied a class of students from the Art Institute to Berlin for a 30-day residency. It was during this period that we were introduced to Ibrahim Mahama by our friend and curator Bettina Klein, co-director of the Visual Arts Division of the DAAD Berliner Artists Program. On her recommendation, we asked Ibrahim to come to the students' studio for an afternoon presentation of his work. We were unprepared for what we experienced. In the course of a 2-hour visit, Ibrahim revealed to that small group gathered in Kreuzberg a complex public practice that operates on a breathtaking scale, leveraging public spaces, infrastructure, and large-scale architecture to communicate the interconnected relationships of labor, capital, contemporary post-colonial conditions, multiple displacements, and specific local histories. These artworks, mostly site-specific and fabricated with objects of everyday use, reveal a rare depth and breadth of association. That they achieve that depth and breadth through a material invocation of these histories and conditions is the sign of Ibrahim's artistic mastery. What does an old jute cocoa bean sack and its accumulated residues tell us about the world? What can old shoeshine boxes reveal to us about the labor of others? As you'll see shortly, the human acts of labor, as well as the history of colonial economics and trade, saturate the work. They're impossible to separate out. The acts of production involving large groups of people over long periods of time and across wide global expanses produces a multiple series of decisions, large and small, that must be made. Indeed, that is the work. And that's where Ibrahim is revealed, in his sensitivity to people, to place, and to material, often produced outside the boundaries of traditional studios, in public squares, in markets, railway repair terminals, and covering the facades of theaters, universities, and housing projects. The complexities of negotiating human laborers with a consciousness of colonial economics or conditions of economic crisis becomes unavoidable. The imperative is to answer those histories with creative ethical tactics, accruing to the work additional political meaning.
With such tactics, communities form around Ibrahim's work. In Ghana, in addition to technicians, his collaborators are mostly migrants who've moved from rural areas to the cities in search of work. These ordinary people have been consistently involved in collaborations in the production of his large-scale public projects. Their labor and the dialogues and negotiations of production are invested in the projects. They are a critical aspect of Ibrahim's work. Aside from the formal and aesthetic aspects of Ibrahim's projects, the conditions of the workers' lives are at the center of his political artistic practice. In conversation, Ibrahim has mentioned materials, spaces, and people as essential considerations. In Athens, for Occupy a Topos residency as part of Documenta 14, the work took place in Syntagma Square. The stitching and construction was out in the open in the heart of Athens, the site of many political demonstrations, as well as in disused factories around the city. For the Venice Biennale, part of his occupation series, Ibrahim hoped to bring a group of Ghanaian collaborators with him to Venice to work, alongside students and others in the construction of his project Out of Bounds. It proved to be impossible to get passports for people without papers, but the failures and contradictions of who gets to travel and who has access to public space are urgent issues of this work. In all of his projects, the labor in public is made visible. This communal working in the public sphere is a dialogue with the current crisis of our time.
Placing these objects, cocoa sacks, shoeshine boxes, discarded medical stretchers, far from their point of origin or use, into new spaces, both public and private, collages and accumulates clashing histories and creates a novel global supply chain. We are conflicted and uncomfortable, trying to resolve all these hugely sensual interruptions. Intuitively, one knows they are irresolvable. Ibrahim puts all of it into motion, our own intelligence, our moral and ethical constructs, and most all of our senses, sight, touch, sound, and smell. And for the most part, we are contending with things outside our own sphere, as the work produces experiences and perceptions that are startling as well as humbling. Humbling for the recognition of our own limitations. We get to see and hear so few artists from Africa, and our context for reception is profoundly constrained by an ignorance and lack of understanding of individual African cultures and experiences, entire worlds outside our own. Ibrahim's work articulates perspectives and positions from a hyperconscious, subaltern, post-colonial condition. Complex and sophisticated, it's important personal work to understand the pieces beyond their spectacular presence.
I am reminded of a conversation we had with Ibrahim about enormous grain silos in Ghana, built with the support of Czechoslovakia during the Nkrumah regime in the 1960s, how they are everywhere and remain abandoned architectural ruins. They are unseen giants in the landscape, no longer in everyday consciousness. He spoke to us about how to repurpose and recuperate these silos, how to make them visible once again, and reinvent them with significance. Perhaps equally important in our few hours with Ibrahim in 2017 was the way he opened up to our students, communicating with compassion, patience, and understanding, responding to questions honestly and with humor. It's there where we experienced a truly special artist. Ibrahim Mahama lives and works in Accra, Kumasi, and Tamale, Ghana. His work has been exhibited worldwide, including All the World's Futures, the 56th Venice Biennale, the Future Generation Art Prize exhibition at the 57th Venice Biennale, Documenta 14 in Athens, Greece, and Kassel, Germany, Orderly and Disorderly in Accra, Ghana, Images 16, An Age of Our Own Making, Denmark, Valletta 18, The Island is What the Sea Surrounds in Malta, and Spectacles Speculation in Kumasi, Ghana. He recently completed a year-long residency with the DAAD Artists in Residence program in Berlin. It's a great honor to have him here with us tonight to share his work and thoughts. Please join us in welcoming Ibrahim Mahama.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello. Hi, let me put this on timer. Thank you very much, Daniel and Ellen, for the very short introduction. Yeah. Yeah, and thank you very much, Andrea, and everyone else that made this talk very much possible. I'm very excited to be here. This is my second time in Chicago, and I was hoping that it wouldn't be cold when I get here, and it's not so cold, so we thank God. Yes, so I guess I'm just going to talk to you about some of the work that I've been doing the last few years, particularly what has motivated the work and the direction, like the kind of direction that my work is going to take in the future. So, as Ellen and Daniel said, I've been in Ghana for many years, like my entire life. I have had all my training there. I studied at the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology, where we have the premier arts college, the College of Art. And I did a Bachelor of Fine Arts there from 2006 to 10. The kind of art that we inherited was, it's not the same as we are practicing with now. With the older generation, particularly given the time that they were in, for a long time, people made art that were following very traditional ideas and very traditional scopes and all that, because a lot of our older generations also had the chance to study abroad in many different universities. So the way they related to art within the 60s and within that period was very different. And also because we had inherited a British curriculum of education, so when people were making art, it always had to be made within a certain dimension, and also always had to follow certain specific sets of conditions and rules. So if you were a painter, you were expected that you would paint and use paints, like oils or acrylic. If you were a painter, you couldn't actually combine it with like sculpture or any other thing. The disciplines were somehow very much classified, and they were just by themselves. When we went to school to study, by then there was a new generation of professors who had, they also had studied in the school, led by Dr. Caricature. They formed a collective called Black Star Lines, and they were more interested in how they could further teach the students to be a bit more liberated, like in doing experiments and like trying all other kinds of forms. So there was a strong, I think there was a deliberate effort to somehow arouse a certain kind of new consciousness within the artists or students within that period to think outside the box of making art out of traditional materials and mediums, and somehow to use the conditions of our time as a medium in itself to produce. Because people would always say, but if you want to be an artist, you'd have to go to America or to Europe or other places, because there they have museums and they have galleries, they have an art system, so being an artist is much easier. But then again, there was also something else to look at, because our generation, we had inherited basically a system where there was no government funding for art, there are no museums, no institutions. So if you're looking back into the 50s, 60s, 70s, even till like the 2000s, where artists were basically practicing and showing their works in hotel spaces or lobbies or all that, you'd ask yourself, was that really what art was about? Just as the same way you'd ask yourself, is art necessarily made to be occupied within museum spaces and all that? These were some of the fundamental questions that we were asking ourselves, and also thinking about how even the idea of crisis in itself, or the idea of failure or decay, because people always say, oh, but in Ghana we don't have these museums, how can you make art? But then again, I don't necessarily I think art predates anything. And one of the things that we had to use, like particularly as an artist, that I thought was important, was to somehow come to the point of realization that at a point when art is made, we don't necessarily think that we know art to be. The idea of paradox was something that became really important. So I started the talk with an image of one of the silos in Ghana. So so Ghana has a long history, long colonial history, from the Danish to the Portuguese, British, Dutch. This was built in the early 1960s by a couple of architects from Poland. Basically a lot of Eastern European architects did a lot of work in Ghana during the Cold War period. And for us, our first president, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, he was kind of a leftist, and he believed somehow that infrastructure was very vital to somehow thinking about a certain kind of consciousness or liberation. So when these silos were built, that was around the period in which a lot of African countries were gaining independence. And he himself, he thought that independence couldn't necessarily be, the independence of Ghana wasn't necessarily a total victory until it's somehow tied to the emancipation of the entire continent. So some of the architecture was actually in response to that, because Ghana had, we basically before we were Gold Coast, so we had a lot of gold which was actually being mined and explored heavily by the British, which a lot of infrastructure was created for it, one of which was the railways, railroads. I guess it was built in many other countries where the British were. But this was actually very important because it was a very part of modernism in a certain sense. But at the same time, if you were thinking about it, you wouldn't necessarily connect it to a certain kind of freedom in its sense. In 1966, there was a political coup which ousted Nkrumah. So a lot of these buildings and infrastructure he was working on came to a halt. A lot of them were never completed to begin with. So the grains that were meant to be stored in it, which were supposed to be used as a point to negotiate with the West in somehow creating a certain system for the continent, never happened. So there's a reason why I am talking about them, because they have many of them around the country. And for close to 60 years, we've always seen these infrastructure, but actually it's very strange when you see something all the time, but your mind never really comes to it or what it means and all that. And I thought that was kind of interesting, and also it could be important. It could be important for not just art, but also making things that could somehow further engage the society a bit more critically. Other infrastructures. So this is actually a detail from a chimney at the Second locomotive workshop, which is in the western part of Ghana, Second. And it was a railway workshop which was meant for the fixing and repair of trains, which was built in the early 1900s by the British also. And I like how some of these infrastructure over the years, somehow the character and also the crisis and the conditions of society somehow accumulated within them in a way. So I like the idea of using paradox always as a starting point to produce. If you look at the chimney, you find that there is almost like a garden at the top of the chimney. But it's very unusual, like a garden and a chimney don't work because the chimney actually releases residue, fire, heat. So how possible could life survive within such a place? And those were the things that I wanted more people within our generation to look at, because there are some things that just seem virtually impossible. But when we somehow pick up on these little things that exist within our society, we can somehow look much further. Yeah. So of course, when I was a student, I was already interested in some of the materials that I work with today. But a lot of them I was actually just exploring or writing more about within my notebook. The jute sack, of course, I was very much interested in. But in the beginning, I quite didn't understand what I was working with. I used to make very figurative things. So I would use the jute sack to wrap figures that I would make, molds, and all that. But later on, I realized that it's the material in itself, there were certain points of it which had accumulated so much. And given the fact that these same materials were produced in India and Bangladesh and coming to Ghana, it's not Ghanaian in the first place. But the way that the material turns to axe, because if they put cocoa in it and then they take it out, and then they put maize, rice, charcoal, all the different residues and other things that are left within the material. So over time, it's almost, because sometimes the fact of it was that when they use it for cocoa, which the material is normally used for, they can't use it for any other commodity, for cocoa again, but they can use it for any other commodity. So the contradiction is that you can only use it for cocoa just once, but any other commodity, you can use it as many times as you want, because cocoa is the #1 export commodity from Ghana, and I think Ghana is the second largest producer of cocoa in the world. So it fetches us the highest of our revenue, which a lot of the money is used in like social urban projects, building roads, buildings, and all that. But when you think about the labor conditions associated with the production of the commodities and how those bodies are associated, you realize that there's a huge disparity. So those, I felt, were somehow, at a point, became accumulated within the material in its physical sense. So on the left-hand side, you see that the material is heavily stitched, but that's because it has gone through a lot of the various usage. The right has a writing on one of the hands of the collaborators, which actually, historically, when people travel from one place to the other, they tend to write their, like some kind of a biodata on their body, because if you died somewhere and you were not recognized, it's almost like a certain kind of trace back to your roots or your ancestry in a way. And for me, I thought that was kind of looking at the condition of the society and the time and how that somehow was registered on the body in relation to the material and how it's treated. But we don't necessarily have time mostly to think about these various connections, the connection between architecture and then the body and then other objects that exist around us. The railway, of course, also played a very significant role within the independence period, but a lot of the workers who worked within the colonial period and post-independence contributed a lot of effort into the restoration of and developing parts of the country. But if you're thinking about it in relation to the states, their labor and other things are never really taken into much account. So it's one of the things that I became very much interested in it. It wasn't necessary for me to do all of this, like spend a lot of time just traveling around the country, just seeing the kind of work that people put into things ordinarily, and not just looking at it as an artist who is going to use it to make work, but just to understand what it meant actually to create something and what the production systems that existed around these things and the objects that it came along with. Because a lot of these men over the years have, through their own intellectual labor, have also contributed a lot into just casting, train parts, because a lot of these things, when they were used within the colonial period afterwards, the parts were no longer being made. So they had to find ways of inventing and making some of these things in order to sustain the railway sector, of course, which is very ineffective now, but at least they try very much. So those things, for me as an artist, it's very, very inspiring actually to see the kind of work that people put into things even without the support of the state. Yeah, so I dig into archives looking for images. A lot of the buildings that were put up within that period were constructed in England and other places, and were reassembled in Ghana. So I also became very much interested in this kind of transition. This is a detail of a building from Athens, Prosphylika. It was built in the early 1930s when a huge population of Greeks had to migrate because of the invasion of the Ottoman Empire. But over the time, it became a place where refugees and many other people who were somehow dislocated would live. During the Second World War, also during the fights between the Allied forces and also just leftists and the Greek government, there were a lot of stains like bombshells and other things that left heavy stains on it. And of course, over the period, in the course of history, the state tried to demolish the buildings because they thought that they didn't somehow represent the Greek spirit. But during my time working on Documenta, I decided to spend a lot of time just living in Greece and trying to understand what the architecture actually meant and the aesthetics and the kind of political history that it came along with. So this is an image of the buildings probably before, and kind of families that lived within those spaces and just trying to live life as it is, like on an ordinary, everyday, So tracing back to factories. So this was another aspect of the work in Documenta in Kassel, which was an old train station, not train station actually, but train manufacturing plant, Henschel. So it's the same place, but I like the fact that as an artist now, I could go back and like play with the space with the same place that was used in the manufacturing of trains could be a same place of residual reflection in a way. So in the work itself, I spent a lot of time just trying to understand what it actually meant to produce as an artist, and how residue, space, history, all those things could play a heavy role within artistic production in a way. So I produce virtually, of course I have a studio, but I also use the city or the state in itself as a studio, so I produce anywhere. And I had this sense of belief that the places that I engage or produce with, the residues and the histories of those spaces somehow inform the work and also somehow contribute towards the character of it and where it occupies at the end of the day. I work over the course of the images you see. There are a lot of these female characters also within my work, my collaborators, and it's also because it's part of the production process, the intense labor that goes actually into the work. A lot of them travel from many different parts of the country, mostly the northern part, also because of the history that we've accumulated over the years, and they come to the south to just do very ordinary work. So most of them are head porters, so they carry things on their head. And they could be as little, sometimes as 6 years old, till as old as they can be, but mostly they're very young women. And it's a kind of a condition that our society has been in for many, many decades. But when you're thinking about even the way society is constructed in terms of different class divisions and all that, they constitute actually the vast labor force of the country. But when you're thinking about them in relation to capital and all that, it's very easy to push them in the background, just as it is in all parts of the world in the way that things are produced or countries operate in a way. So I started actually working with them in the production of the work, knowing that the condition as an artist, because I'm very much aware of how their labor becomes implicated when it goes into an artistic production, knowing that when their labor goes into producing a work of art, at the end of the day, the work of art also becomes something special because capital has a way of dealing with things, because the work, when it enters sometimes within the art market, it also changes. So all those contradictions and things were things that I wanted to ponder over. So finding ways more and more to complicate the work, and then also what's the different perspectives and outcomes that it could take. So we've done a lot of work in different places, so like in the train stations and all that, working with engineers and very different people there. So not necessarily always thinking about art and artists, but also thinking about how the general public, even within the production of a work, because if they don't experience it from the point of production, they will experience it maybe from the point of witnessing it as an installation in a way. And I think all of those are quite valid. So as Ellen and Daniel said, in Athens, one of the decisions I made was actually not to install the work, but actually to engage the public from the point of production. So we chose Syntagma Square, which is like very politically charged. Each time there is a protest in Greece, you find Syntagma Square filled with bodies and all that. And I thought it could be interesting just putting a piece of sacks there that have traveled around the world and engaging the public into sewing it in a way that the sacks somehow represent like this kind of a global audience in a way. So I got a permit from the parliament, the Greek parliament, and we used the drone to photograph this. Just a way to give a sense of this idea of the work. So it's very small. So it's almost like a stain within the landscape, but it resonates actually with the time and also with the politics and everything. Yeah. So I spend a lot of time. Sometimes people always think that the artwork is a starting point. Yeah, but I spend a lot of time looking at things. So this is a drawing of one of the modernist buildings, actually in my university in Kumasi, Unity Hall. It's a twin tower, and it was one of the projects that I did after the Venice Biennale 2 years, almost 3 years ago, but this was 2 years ago. And yeah, so I went back to the university archive, actually going through some of the older drawings, just trying to understand what these structures were and how to deal with them, and trying to produce a work that somehow conceals, but at the same time, it also reveals. Yeah, so it does both things at the same time. So whether the work is on the building or not, I think there's already a lot happening within the image. So I like to consider that very much. Some of the earlier works that I did, this was the very first installation I did in 2012, and it was installing the work in a market space. And I thought it was actually quite interesting because at that point, I was still very much an artist. I was not working, I didn't have any collaborators. I was doing everything by myself, so I would stay just in the studio and sew and sew and sew because I wanted to understand the structure of the material I was working with. But on the last day of 2012, I wanted to go into the new year with a new spirit. So I said, today I'm going to end the year on a very good note. So I'm going to do an installation. So I went to the market and I spoke to the market women because I'd been collecting a lot of the sacks from them. And of course, we had built a relationship over time because all the materials that I collect, I first of all buy new ones and I give it to them and I take the old ones that are thrown because I'm interested in the exchange value. So they were asking me, so how do you want this thing to be done? And I said, oh, well, I have an idea to install it over the food. And they said, can we help you? And I said, yeah, why not? And that was a turning point actually in my life because when they did it, the form wasn't actually what I could imagine because the form, the drapes, and all the things that happened within it were things that parts were stretched, parts were left loose. I possibly couldn't have thought about that within that sense at that moment in making the art that I thought I knew I was making. So at that point, I realized so a lot of the things I've said before is actually like a post thing to this. So this was much earlier to a lot of the ideas that I was speaking to before. So that's when I realized actually how important it was to factor in the production and also the architectural elements. So experience became important to me. So I thought, do we always have to produce work for human experience? I started looking into producing works into spaces where people couldn't go. So sometimes the work would be in a tunnel, would be in a gutter, where maybe it could just be a relationship between the work and then the space, or with the bacterial life and all those things within those spaces. It was important for me because coming from a tradition where you don't have institutions and all that, it's important to somehow begin to think that, because when with museums, the white cube and all that, we always have this sense of belief as artists that we're making a work for an audience. So people are always asking questions like, if you're going to show your work here, who is going to see the work? Or who is going to buy the work? I say, oh no, but there are plants and animals there, maybe. Maybe, yeah. And it's interesting because some of these spaces, when the work is installed and you realize, and the conditions of the space, and you take it to a different space, you realize that the form actually changes, the form of the work, and you have no control over it. So it was something I wanted to play with. So you realize in the image, you only have cows. And yeah, people say, but where are the human beings? But actually, the condition of the space already implicates the human. So I don't necessarily think that if the work happens, there have to be human beings there to experience it, because there's a lot more that constitutes the image of the work, and also just the architecture. So it's not always focusing on the so-called artwork, but also the things that somehow characterize them. So both of them somehow become one. Some of these were works that I was doing when I was doing my MFA. So this was, I think, one of the earlier works in 2013. And this also, so this was the museum in our university that had just been completed, and they were thinking of what to do with it. Yeah. Yeah, it was built as a museum, but afterwards there were many thoughts. But I thought, yeah, it could be interesting to somehow play with the forms of the building. So I did, so I always went to spaces, public spaces, like governmental spaces, negotiating with architects, engineers, seeing how best we could somehow create forms or invent forms that would allow people to somehow experience art differently or ask different questions. Yeah, so, and so from all kinds of spaces, market spaces where people ordinarily would just do business. And people would always ask questions like, what is the use of this? What is it? Because the material somehow had this kind of sublime effect. So, and people have this sense of beauty in their mind and how they think about things. So they always say, oh, but this is such an ugly material. And then we always say, oh, but at least when something is ugly, you still live with it and you ponder over it, you ask questions. So there were things that I thought that were important, because within the older traditional sense, if I were just to be a painter using the same canon or history to produce and then just show the work, people would come into the context of the exhibition knowing that they were coming to see art and they had all the knowledge in the world about art. They would come and sometimes they would pretend to know what they were seeing and looking at. And yeah, I thought, no, why not invent something that we would all learn together? Even myself as an artist, in the process of doing it, I'm figuring things out as I go along. 2014, I did my first international exhibition in London at the SAIC Gallery. It was a group show, but it was also very different. It was the first time I was almost doing this in the room, so like having this kind of painterly quality and all that because of my background, my painting background. I thought it was something that I could explore further. This was at the Broad Museum in Michigan, in a building by Zaha Hadid. In Copenhagen at the Kunsthal Charlottenburg as part of a group exhibition. This was my final MFA exhibition. I think it was I was invited to do the Venice Biennale when I was doing my MFA, so it was quite a difficult period for me, having to think that just being an arts student, I was going to exhibit on such a world platform. So, there were many difficult questions that I asked myself. I think I'll come to that image shortly. So I experimented heavily with many things. So as you can see, I somehow built a lot of my practice on like just developing an independent practice and using the conditions of space and also the time and also many other factors as a point to produce. And mostly I was producing the work for myself, to be honest with you. I wasn't really producing. Of course, I knew that there was going to be an audience for it, but I spent a lot of time just doing the work because I knew that it was going to be important to somehow opening up the landscape and also how artists could somehow respond to the spaces that we have. So to the Venice Biennale. And it was quite interesting within that period because I went to Venice as a very young artist. I was 26, I think, at the time. And it was, there were questions to ask because when you're invited at a very early stage of your career to do something like that, normally there's so much enthusiasm, and also you're very nervous. But for some reason, I wasn't nervous, but I wasn't so enthusiastic. I was more or less concerned with how I was going to negotiate my way with the exhibition because I was invited and the curator had known my work, but also he knew my work, I would say, from a Western context because he had seen my work installed in Europe. But the way my work had been installed in Europe wasn't necessarily how I had created my practice. So when I made a couple of proposals and then we went back and forth and finally they said, but we have this room that we might want you to show your work in. And I said, actually, I would actually like to come to Venice because I'd never been to Venice before. So I went to Venice and then fortunately for me, the curator was there and we had a very interesting conversation. And I think through the conversation, he understood more what I actually wanted to do. So when we're walking back through this long, endless corridor in the corridor, he stopped and said, maybe this could actually work for you. And I said, actually, that was what I was thinking of, but now that you've said it. Actually that's how it came into being, just through having to negotiate. Because I think sometimes as young artists, there's this tendency that when an exhibition comes along and there is, when the makers of the exhibition say, we want your work to be here, it's almost like it's final. But I think that, our voices are very important because without artists, there will be no exhibitions in the first place. And I think that we have to negotiate rightfully, knowing exactly what we want and how we want our works to somehow contribute towards the shaping of an exhibition and its context. Over the course of time, since the Venice Biennale, I've done a lot of different work using the ideas of architecture and all the things I spoke about as a point to reinvent my practice. Because people would always say also, if you're an artist just making work and it's successful, why would you change it? But for me, the work is never settled because I'm always looking for new ways to tell maybe the same story or to tell other stories in a way or to somehow instigate other discussions and all that. And I started collecting these shoemaker boxes, which are heavily used by young men also who migrate to the city center. And also, what I like to do sometimes is that I like to complicate the objects in itself a lot more. So I would collect original shoemaker boxes, and then I would make new ones and exchange them. But also, I would make shoemaker boxes that when the shoemakers themselves see it, it seems quite absurd in its origin and also the materials that come to form it. And most of these materials are coming from old industrial spaces which have decayed over the last 5 or 6 decades or before. And I thought all those materials had aesthetics within them that could somehow communicate. So I would just randomly go to the railways or different places and then send proposals of having to juxtapose these objects that I've made with the locomotives and other things, train engines and all that, and photograph them. Some of them are shown within institutions. So this was at the White Cube Gallery last year, and a solo show that I did, Fragments. And it's actually very different, when you think about the context of how it changes. But I like it, actually, being conscious about that as an artist and how you're very much interested in how the extent at which artistic freedom could be expressed. But at the same time, you're also very much thinking about how that somehow the idea of the institution also becomes implicated within that system. So it's not just, I've done the work and the work can go anywhere. I think it's very important that we somehow understand these differences and what they do within the world. So the different forms. So this was in Kiev, part of the Pinchuk, the Future Generation Art Prize, which went to Venice later. So this, I think this is in Brasilia. It was an exhibition earlier this year, but it was a work that was made in Brazil, which has been traveling for the last 2 years. So the work always takes a different form. So it's the same work here, but this time it takes a different form. The same here, it takes a different form. So, this is sculpture that was made earlier this year in collaboration with a sculptor in Antwerp, in Belgium. And it's an old racist monument that exists in Antwerp. And it's of a reverend priest, Father de Decan, who traveled through the Congolese, the Belgian colonies. And in one of the statues that is made that stands in Antwerp, you have the Belgian priest with the so-called Congolese savage kneeling at his knees, almost like asking for some kind of a salvation. And we thought it was quite interesting, like when I was doing this research, invited to do these projects there. But I somehow wanted to replicate the sculpture, but the material of the sculpture was something I wanted to work with. So we made a replica of it, and we made it in rubber, because rubber was one of the materials that was extensively extracted from Congo. So you have the same sculpture, but this time it's in rubber. It's not on a pedestal. And also the work in which the statue was made out of clay was preserved. So we had a performative section where the audience had to intervene within it. So the sculpture was a bit fragmented afterwards, so we used it as part of the exhibition. So Yeah, so we recordings of the sessions, which were also part of the exhibition and all that. So I like this fact that you can somehow experiment and create a practice that somehow outlives the way you think about making work. Yeah, so this was an exhibition that I did as part of the DAAD scholarship. Yeah, so it was medic stretchers that were used in the Second World War that I collected from Greece. And I further complicated them by bringing archives from Ghana and also using this cloth, typically. It's any cloth, bed sheets, spreads, blankets that are used by fishmongers in the coast to wrap fish when they are smoking them. So after several years, you have the smell of the fish somehow engulfed within the cloth in itself. So it changes the cloth in the way you perceive it, the smell and all that. So I made replicas of these stretchers and I wrapped them in the cloth. So when you enter the gallery, the first thing you smelled was blood and fish smell and all that. And for some reason, people couldn't, you ask yourself, what's the connection between that and then a group of objects that were used within the Second World War? And I said, actually, you ask yourself, because the world has become so complicated and intertwined with our histories over the last centuries. So I think it's very much possible to somehow create these scenarios which broadens our perspectives on the way we look at the world. And you realize that when they're singular objects, but when you arrange them, sometimes it almost looks like this kind of an abstract painting in a way, but they're this singular. So I somehow enjoy them, like having to make all these different decisions within making work. So back to the cabinets, like collecting these old cabinets from like schools and like textbooks and all that, which became part of the experience of the exhibition. So people could go through old historical materials, photographs and all that. Yeah, so this is the last part of my presentation actually that goes into why, like, my interest, my future interest. So I've been taking a lot of, not inspiration per se, but looking at how spaces, like we're starting with practicing as an artist with this idea that the lack of institutions, and also how people generally produce as artists, because if you grow up within a system where you have spaces that inspire you to create, then I think that you would grow up becoming a different kind of an artist in a way. Just as sometimes people are really motivated by having to create practices because they know there are institutions that exist around them. So it was one thing that I wanted to spend a better part of my younger life working on, because I think now I'm 31, I've seen so much, more than enough I could see in a lifetime in making art, and why not dedicate a significant part of my younger life now to actually thinking about producing objects or things that actually have a better effect on the system itself. So I started working on these studio exhibition spaces kind of a thing. And also, as I said before, the gap between the older generation and ours, I thought it was really important to somehow close that gap through exhibitions, public programs. So I created this space specifically for doing exhibitions of like older artists who did a lot of work, but their works were never really recognized, but somehow played a very effective role in like our generation. Because in a way, sometimes it becomes quite an illusion, like when you think about how you produce as an artist, because for a long time, you might just keep producing and producing and producing, but I'm also thinking about what actually the production means. So I'm actually working on these different spaces now, which act as studio spaces, but also as institutions in themselves, which artists are invited to somehow work and intervene within. And you realize that within just this simple act of having to move from making objects that exist within spaces, a lot of the spaces I was talking about, into somehow inventing these spaces, it already changes the foundation for artistic practice in a way, or contributes to it largely. And I think that for me at this point in my life, that is something that I think that is really, really, really important. Of course, it is something that we had spent a significant part of our being students just deliberating and thinking about. So what better way is it to somehow expand upon this? So so as I said before, there are many different things that I want to work on. So working with private individuals, the state, in objects that were used before. So trains, aircraft, taking them, because the spaces that I'm working on mostly are within the northern part of the country. And people would ask yourself, why would you do or create this within the north? Because you don't have any audience, art audience there. And most of the collaborators, that's where they're coming from, because it's the most impoverished and poor part of the country. But I think that there's actually something really interesting to be done there, because if you create something, people are not actually coming to see it with the perspective that they're going to see art. I think it's more or less about engaging the community and creating conditions that somehow inspire young people within those communities to think differently about what their position within the world actually is. So I've spent a lot of time collecting archives, some of the archives which are used for exhibitions, but some of them are actually just making these archives which do not become exhibition objects, but somehow become part of the architecture and the institutions that's created. There's going to be an 8-minute film that would play just after this, so we'll watch it quickly, and afterwards we would engage in a Q&A session. So drawings, So I collect all these things. I've collected an extensive things like archives and all that, and these things, when institutions are created based on the foundation of these things, I think it somehow allows people to think critically when they are responding to these spaces, rather than just thinking that they are there and I'm supposed to make work that is supposed to just fit within it. I think that there is a lot more at stake, particularly when we are making art within our generation and also within our time. So this is the last 2 images of like drawings within my notebook of actually having to think of how to rethink about these spaces and actually rebuilding or reconstituting these spaces. So I want to spend the next 5 years actually to see how we can somehow create an alternative system or create things from scratch by using the already existing language that exists. Thank you. Please, can you play the video? I tried to make it on time.
This people they wait. Our man will bring them this morning. Where is the support? Make you come. Hey, you can't put them on the back.
Yeah, so at this point, we would invite any questions that there are.
Hi, thank you. Hello, hello.
Hello.
Hi, thank you for your talk. My name is Kekeli, and I wanted to ask a question about your work kind of in relation to Doris Salcido and Christian Jean-Claude. It seems like you're employing similar strategies in your interest in material, its history, and kind of the embedded narratives within that. How do you situate yourself within that context? And are you speaking to their practices, or are you kind of pulling from a similar kind of visual language? I just want to know what your thoughts were around a similar kind of formalism, but also concepts.
Yeah, I guess sometimes as artists, we might share different aesthetics and all that, but I think we have different concerns because Doris and I, we work with the same gallery. I've been in art school. I read extensively on her work. For me, she's like one of the greatest artists who ever lived. Yeah, but at the same time, in relation to the context and also what motivates me to produce work is entirely very different. But I think that, as you said, we somehow fall within a certain kind of visual language and all that. And I somehow take that very seriously, particularly when I'm producing work and knowing how some of these artists have somehow produced work within their own context over the decades. Yeah, so that somehow inspires me, particularly when it comes to thinking about making work.
I was wondering if you could speak to the politics and the process of installation and how speedily these projects go from concept to execution.
I guess, for instance, if there's a project I'm interested in, I start by making notes and visiting the site over and over again. And a lot of these sites belong to different owners. So sometimes it belongs to the state, sometimes they belong to private owners. So you have to find the owner first of all to negotiate. Sometimes there are multiple owners. So for instance, some of the projects are still under construction. So you have to speak to the engineer, you have to speak to the architect, you have to speak to the client, you have to speak to the managers of the project, and all of them somehow have to agree. And a lot of the time, most of the projects I plan, they never get realized because if one party says no, then that's it. But sometimes you need just one party who has like the superpower, who says yes, and all the other parties, it doesn't really matter. Like a church that I was interested in working with, and the architects, the contractors, all of them said no, this will not happen. But the priest who was the client who commissioned the project, I just went to his office and I spoke to him and he said, go ahead and do it. And I said, but the architect said no. And he said, the architect, it doesn't matter, yeah, so that's, so I guess it's, yeah. And then I have to find the resources to make it happen, get the collaborators. I also work with a lot of technology because because the work is ephemeral. So I'm thinking about how the work will be documented and also how it will feel within like a film context and then just photography. So I've spent a lot of time teaching myself photography. So all the projects in my publications and also that I use, I photograph everything by myself. Because I tried for some time trying to engage photographers, but it was always very different in terms of the feel, the image, the perspectives, the angles, because sometimes when you engage commercial photographers, they almost treat it like it's like some kind of a shoot, like it's a wedding photo they're taking. And I thought, no, like there is something really, because you're inventing a language, so you somehow also need to invent the perspectives in which you want the world to see them through. So all those things become part of the process and the work gets done and I think of the next project. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Yuri, and I also come from this country, from Eastern Europe, without any
Yeah.
art infrastructure, right? So this my question is about
Yes.
this, right? So how this transformation, how did you transform this from this country without any kind of art infrastructure into this kind of quite successful global artist working in prestige Western art institutions, right? And also, do you find it's much more sense, as I understand, you still work in Ghana, right? So you didn't actually move to West, right? So you find it.
Can you slow your question down?
Okay. My question is about transformation of you as these artists from Ghana
Yes.
without any art infrastructure into quite successful global artists making projects in Western art institutions, and also you still work in the West, but still, as far as I understand, you still remained. So most of your work you still live in Ghana, right? You still didn't move to the West, right? So you think maybe it's much more sense to work in Ghana, right, than to move to the West, right? So yeah, this is my question.
Yes, I guess so. I guess that's the reason why I've been there all this time, yeah, without actually moving, because it's important. When I finished my MFA, or even before that, it was very easy to decide that I would move elsewhere and live there and work. But I didn't think it made sense because I had created my practice out of this very necessary, difficult condition, and it somehow taught me to think differently about the approach into making art and also thinking about the audience that I was making the work for. So having to move somehow would have been a betrayal to myself, first of all, because I feel it's important, particularly within the most difficult times and conditions, to remain within a place and to see how those can be resolved and new futures can be created out of it. So of course, I travel. Being an artist is inevitable. You'd go around the world and do things. But I think for me, the base is something really important because I want to be known as someone who contributed significantly to the shift within the space I came from, rather than just coming from there and then being somewhere and being an artist. Yeah. Yes. We have time.
Hi, thank you so much for that talk. My question is basically that at the beginning of your talk, you mentioned breaking free of practice-specific expectations. So your example was that a painter must paint and use paint as a medium. So how do you feel like that mentality can be mirrored in your work when you're using primarily one material?
Yeah, it's with regards to that, I was talking about an attitude, particularly in making art. All my training has been in painting. Even in high school, I did a 3-year program in painting and sculpture. I did my bachelor's in painting. I did my MFA in painting, my PhD in painting. So there was this heavy sense to go back to the idea of painting all the time. Sometimes people think when you say it, maybe you have something against painting. No, I think painting is actually wonderful. And for me, it's more or less about trying to break those classifications and think more openly. Because if you're a sculptor or an architect, or even you're in theater, what prevents you actually from trying different mediums and also expanding? Because sometimes these mediums and these objects, even they come to educate even you yourself into the way you look into the world. Because sometimes we think that we know the world and we're trying to explain it by using what there is in those traditional mediums. But maybe by trying something different, it gives you a totally different perspective. And for me, that element of surprise is something that I'm interested in. Just trying something that somehow, whether it succeeds or not, at least there is something that we learn in the process. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi. I had a question about the politics of the people who were working in your project. I'm sure you've got this question before. But I was thinking about, do they get to see or understand the larger system that they're working in, and like what art means to you, and how do you communicate what goes on?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So one of the things that triggered was the fear when I used to see them when I was in Dhaka, and it's about the workplace safety, and it's about the the equal payment or the payment that they get, that they get, like in any global south country.
Yeah.
Yes, like you can get that. So did your collaborator have the agency to refuse to collaborate with your work, or how did you make sure that they were safe?
Yeah, certainly. I think, I can repeat his question. I think he is asking about the collaborators in their participation within the work and whether they sometimes agree to do a project or not. Because growing up in Bangladesh, he's witnessed a lot of like buildings that have been put up, particularly with the scaffolding and also the safety nets around them and what they represent and all that. Yes, and to answer your question, it's yes. As I said before, many of the time, a lot of the people I try to work with, it doesn't work out because also there is this sense of superstition attached to the work. Because I think for me, it's in the beginning, I was always trying to convince people of art that I was doing. But I realized that it wasn't working. If people get to learn, particularly that you have a degree and you have an MFA and you're going around collecting these strange objects, they view you to be very strange in a way. So first of all, that doesn't really work for anyone. But you always have to, so it's the relationship process that is important. So I realized that it was important to build and create these relationships. And actually, coming from where I am, relationships are very important. It's actually very different from, because I've done a lot of projects around the world, and having to work back home, there is this sense of freedom because of the system that exists, that people based on goodwill, they are willing to help or to assist on things that generally in the West you wouldn't have happen, because everything is based on a foundation of capital in a way. So it's also trying to really understand, coming to your question, about the conditions that somehow motivate these projects in a way. The collaborators would sometimes, I think, one of not a success per se, but one of the things that constantly comes out of it is that you spend a long time interacting and talking to people within the city and producing these things. And there are always interesting questions that come out of it, because people are not, like for instance, when the installations and things are done, or you go around the city and you're talking to people about work, they're not really talking to you from a point of knowing something. It's almost like both of you are trying to have a conversation and you're trying to understand something together. Because when the installation is done, the constellations within the spaces always change. So it's not a museum or within an artistic context where the work is there and then we know that it's going to be constant all the time. The constellations within the market space, it changes. Like, I'll give you an example. I spend months in collecting these materials, negotiate with the people that I'll come back several months later to do an installation. I come back within the same space. Some agree, some do not agree. Those that agree are a smaller percentage of those who do not agree. But those who are the smaller percentage are the market women, and virtually they control everything in the market. So with their veto powers, they say this must happen. And in the process of having to make it happen, the work totally collapses and it becomes a complete failure. But then, they don't understand what's happening, like fully, in a sense of me being an artist and trying to do something. But there is a certain sense of collaboration there, and also trying to understand the work and effort that is going into this kind of a production. So they come back to a point of saying, look, how can we best help you to be able to get this thing done? There is something really nonsensical about it within that time, if you think about it, because what does it do to them? Because art, after all, is something that we can live without. But for some reason, they want to make sure that it gets done, at least something gets done. And for me, I think that is really important, particularly when we consider how building relationships somehow keep, like it's a certain kind of, it's like some kind of restoration of life in a way that any other thing, capital or just the way that the world has been systematized doesn't really do for us.
We are out of time. Ibrahim, thank you.
Well, thank you.